Timothy Piazza was preparing for a long, wild night during the winter of 2017. He was a college sophomore at Penn State University and a brand new pledge at Beta Theta Pi fraternity. This particular night was his first time pledging, and he would have to meet a challenge to prove his commitment to the fraternity brothers by consuming 18 drinks in just an hour and 22 minutes. This dangerous level of binge drinking was a part of a hazing ritual for the fraternity's pledges, an undertaking Piazza was expected to complete in order to become a fully realized member of Beta Theta Pi. At some point in the early hours of the morning, Piazza fell down a flight of stairs that led into the fraternity house basement. 12 hours would go by before anyone would call 911, and tragically, Piazza succumbed to brain trauma from his fall. He died with a blood alcohol level that was 4.5 times the legal limit. For many students, Greek life can be an immensely positive college experience. Lifelong friendships can be forged, and members can encounter opportunities for success by making connections through fraternities and sororities. However, Greek life has never been completely free of controversy, and there's a more sinister side to these organizations that goes farther back in history than most students realize. After Piazza's death, Pennsylvania became the 45th state to enact anti-hazing laws. Hazing isn't exclusive to Greek life, but it's become closely associated with fraternity culture, due in part to a long history marred with sporadic instances of extreme, torturous rituals that resulted in deadly consequences for young college students. Unfortunately, Piazza was just one of many students whose lives were cut short due to such rituals. And while each of these tragedies left a lasting impact, there was one death in particular in the early 20th century that was so shrouded in mystery, sensationalism, and horror that it may have left behind a restless spirit. The year was 1905. A new century had begun, and society had undergone vast changes from the previous century. But for many Americans, higher education wasn't easily attainable, usually only an option for young white men from prominent, wealthy families. One of these young white men, Stewart Pierson, was the son of an affluent lumber industry businessman hailing from Cincinnati, Ohio. When it was decided that Stewart would enroll in Kenyon College, he took the train to the campus in Gambier and promptly became a part of Kenyon's freshman student body. Soon after his enrollment, he would seek to become a member of another student group on campus. Kenyon College was also the site of Delta Kappa Epsilon, a fraternity that Stewart's father, Newbold Pierson, was an alumnus of. Stewart likely believed that following his father's footsteps would bridge his journey through higher education with future prosperity. Not long after Stewart became a pledge, Newbold boarded a train so that he could attend his son's induction into the fraternity. Newbold's train would arrive in Gambier very late in the evening, and Stewart would wait for his father, staying awake through the night into the next morning. Curiously, he would purchase a bottle of chloroform, amongst other items for his initiation into DKE, keeping them in a basket he carried with him. These details would become ominously significant after Stewart would begin his participation in the frat's hazing ritual and the final hours of his life. While the full details of the ritual are sparse, they feature the usual humiliating and degrading pranks one would expect. One local mentioned that he would see the fraternity brothers pulling visibly drunk initiates along with ropes and forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees. This portion of the ritual, though embarrassing for pledges, wasn't particularly dangerous. However, another known detail of the ritual included sending pledges alone to isolated places away from campus, and as the day gave way to night, things would begin to take a deadly turn. For this last test of bravery, each of the initiates were assigned a different location They were instructed to leave campus together before splitting up at their own remote places and wait in darkness and solitude until a DKE committee arrived to take them back. Stewart said goodbye to his father at his dormitory around 9 o'clock that evening, after he was given instructions to walk to the end of the railway bridge off campus. Newbold would join the other members at the DKE fraternity lodge after his departure. It was the last time he would see his son alive. No one will ever know for certain what happened in the minutes between 9 p.m. and 9:41 p.m. on the railway bridge above the Kokosing River. What grisly and controversial details were offered during the hasty investigation that followed would whip yellow journalism newspapers into a frenzy of speculation, suspicion, and sensationalism. As the hour approached 10 o'clock, one dreadful fact would soon be uncovered. The trains that took Stewart and his father before him to Kenyon College were the very thing that took his life that night. Those aboard the unscheduled locomotive that passed through the railway bridge didn't realize they had struck Stewart until they made a disturbing discovery when they stopped for maintenance in Mount Vernon. Engineer Jeff Finata and his crew discovered blood splattered on the train, along with bits of fabric. By the time the crew concluded that something tragic had taken place, a committee of 4 fraternity brothers, including Stewart's roommate, had arrived at the railway bridge to bring him back and conclude his induction into DKE. They called his name and whistled for him, but got no response. They found the basket he had taken lying undisturbed in the grass, with all of its items still inside. The brothers continued calling his name while they walked towards the bridge, thinking that he may have crossed it and was out of earshot on the other side. As the brothers made their way onto the bridge, they came upon a horrific scene. Stewart's body was strewn across the tracks in front of them. Before they had time to process the shock of this discovery, the brothers heard a train's whistle in the distance. If the young men didn't act quickly, they could meet the same fate. The brothers grabbed a hold of Stewart's body and hustled off the tracks as the sound of the approaching locomotive crescendoed. Safely back onto the grass, they heard another sound. It was the campus clock striking 10. With each chime of the clock, the reality and weight of the tragedy took hold of the DKE brothers as they looked down at Stewart's body in the grass, his broken wristwatch frozen at 9:41 p.m. How had Stewart ended up in the path of an oncoming train? Was he really waiting alone that night for the committee, or were other DKE brothers present? Why was he unable to move out of the train's way? Was he unconscious, or was he restrained in some way? Each of these questions would be raised, debated, and contested all across the country in the weeks following this night, as more concerning post-mortem details would come into focus. Stewart's roommate, known only as A.E. York, was the first of the 4 to take the next action. He sprinted through the woods and up a hill to the residence of Kenyon College's president, William Pierce, where he recounted the terrible event. At approximately 10:15 p.m., Pierce phoned a physician in Gambier named Dr. Irvin Workman and told him to meet him at the bridge. The men then brought Stewart's body back to Pierce's home, and the news was broken to Newbold. Workman examined the body, noting that it appeared to have been dragged and rolled over multiple times, resulting in an arm being nearly torn off and broken wrist. Pierce helped Newbold arrange for a train to bring his son's body home to Cincinnati right away. It wasn't until after his body left Gambier that the local authorities were notified of the tragedy. As the news of Stewart's death spread through Gambier the next morning, a coroner from a neighboring town named William W. Scarborough visited the site of the death. But upon his arrival, he discovered the site had already been cleaned of any blood, tissue, and bone fragments that were left behind when the body was moved. With forensic science being extremely limited in 1905, this piece of evidence that could have potentially revealed significant information on Stewart's death had been washed away. Scarborough would have to travel to Cincinnati to examine the body and seek out what other information it might offer on what happened the night before. Dr. Workman had already made note of the extensive damage to the body, including a broken wrist, but Scarborough's examination offered up a more sinister explanation as to why Stewart was hit by the train in the first place. The body's right wrist and ankle bones had been pulled out of their sockets, and there were marks on the skin consistent with tight cords of rope. This, along with the tampering of evidence at the railway bridge, was enough for Scarborough to question whether this was really a tragic accident or foul play. He promptly called for Knox County officials to launch a legal investigation of the incident, and by the next month, he was obliged. The inquest included 33 witnesses, one of whom was Gambier resident Ralph McMahon. McMahon offered up another piece of alarming information, first explaining that he was the one to clean the tracks, finding a little piece of skull, a little piece of jawbone. Then he revealed it was one of the DKE fraternity brothers who asked him to clean the site, even promising him $3 to complete the job, although McMahon said the student never paid up. Out of all these findings, two primary, conflicting explanations would emerge. The first being President William Pierce's assertion that Stewart, exhausted from staying up the night before, fell asleep and was too disoriented to flee in time when the train barreled down the tracks, ruling his death a tragic accident. Coroner William Scarborough's suspicion of foul play had enough weight to be justified as a second explanation. Besides the bruising on the body, there were also several questionable components to Stewart's death. The fact that the local police weren't notified until after Stewart's body had left Gambier, and that the site had been cleaned before it could be examined for evidence. There was also the initial portion of the hazing ritual to take note of, the practice of pulling inebriated DKE pledges with ropes. It was entirely plausible that the brothers took the final portion of the initiation process to a more extreme place, using the same ropes they used for pulling Stewart along earlier to fasten him to the tracks. Finally, there was the bottle of chloroform that Stewart had in his possession. Did this also play a role? Could he have been instructed by the brothers to use it to add to the challenge of the hazing ritual? Most would agree that even the deepest sleeper would awake to the sound of an oncoming train before it got too close. But if the same individual was under the influence of both alcohol and chloroform, they would likely be rendered comatose. There was another element to this calamity that further muddied the waters. The yellow press newspapers that focused more on scandal-mongering than accurate reporting. While some might criticize today's press as fake news, they truly have nothing on the press of the early 20th century, before journalistic ethics were regularly adhered to. These articles were often laced with opinion, full of exaggeration, and saturated with speculation. So naturally, most of the press promoted and sided with Scarborough's hypothesis rather than Pierce's recounting. Not because it could be closer to the truth, but because it offered a more scandalous and dramatic tale for their readers. A couple of articles even linked a second student death to Stewart's killing, weaving a convoluted web of conspiracy. Not long after the investigation had begun, a student named James McGarvey was found deceased by his roommate in Bexley Hall on Kenyon's campus. He had been gagged, and his hands and feet were bound. Money and a gold ring had been stolen off of him, and a note pinned to his stomach read, "This wilt do for this time, but if we come again, it will be worse." The papers posited that McGarvey had been feeding information on the DKE members to Scarborough during the investigation and was subsequently killed off by the brothers. Despite the apparent relevance and magnitude of this possible revelation, no other details on James's death were made available, and he was never brought up by Scarborough or any witnesses during the investigation of Stewart's death. The relentless stories became so slanderous that Pierce was forced to release a detailed statement of defense to the press, hoping to salvage the reputation of DKE and Kenyon College, as well as his own. In the statement, he countered a few of what he called falsehoods, including McMahon's claim that a DKE brother had been the one to order the cleanup of the bridge. He explained, "On Sunday morning, the coroner, who lives in another town, was informed by the doctor of the accident, and at the time of his arrival, I had assembled all persons who knew anything about the affair. But he had little to say to us, and did not even come to my house to take possession of the boy's clothing. He expressed his annoyance that the traces of the accident had been washed away from the bridge. This had been done on his own responsibility by Frank Deal, the village marshal, who wished to disappoint morbid curiosity. The bridge was not cleaned by the order of any group of students. It is not the custom of the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity, nor any other fraternity in Kenyon College, to tie its initiates to the railroad track." The fraternity brothers also got a chance to defend themselves to the jury and to the public, one of them explaining that the chloroform was a bluff and that Stewart had not been instructed to use it or drugged. The newspapers contested this, but they offered no substantial evidence to suggest that Stewart was under the influence of chloroform. While Scarborough did examine Stewart's body, he never performed a full autopsy, so ultimately, it was uncertain what impact, if any, the chloroform had on Stewart's demise. His father Newbold stood with the DKE brothers and Pierce, concluding plainly, "My boy fell asleep." He later stated in an interview that Scarborough was trying to make a reputation at the expense of my wife's heart and my peace of mind. His explanation for the hasty removal of his son's remains was simply to get the body quickly back home to his mourning wife. Through all of these testimonies defending Pierce and DKE, Scarborough maintained his belief that Pierce was staging some kind of cover-up, and Lot Stillwell, the prosecuting attorney for the case, stated, "I shall proceed at once to bring the guilty person to justice." But in the end, neither of these men were able to conclude a suspect or offer enough evidence to move forward with an indictment by the Knox County grand jury. Whether Stewart's final moments were spent in frantic terror, struggling against the ropes that may have bound him to the tracks, or in disoriented confusion, waking up too late to realize the danger he was in, we'll never know for certain. The violent manner in which he died was tragic enough, but the negative drama that followed in some sense added to the tragedy. With his initiation unfinished, his chance to follow in his father's footsteps and potential for his future was also taken from him. The mystery of his last moments and death offer a story that is fragmented and incomplete, and as a result, it's said that Stewart's restless spirit still wanders Kenyon's campus. Through the years, students have claimed to see his ghostly figure along the Cocosine Gap Trail and haunting the former location of the DKE headquarters in the western wing of Old Kenyon. What causes students to cross the line between harmless shenanigans and dangerous, sometimes torturous rituals? The notion behind Greek life hazing rituals is that going through a challenging experience together helps to form strong bonds amongst the group. The more extreme or even traumatic these shared experiences are, the stronger the bonds are thought to be. As the boundaries of hazing are pushed collectively by the group, the individuals in the group become increasingly more likely to follow along, even if what's happening might be against their better judgment or something they normally wouldn't do. This is known as situational conformity, and in some circumstances, it can lead to ignoring consequences, which can be dangerous. According to research, hazing doesn't actually create strong bonds among team members or groups, but instead can lead to distrust among members. If you want to encourage trust, bonding, and genuine friendship in your fraternity, sorority, or team, you should be wary of hazing rituals and instead opt for healthy team-building activities. Not only will it benefit you and those close to you in the long run, but it could very well save you and your friends from serious harm or tragedy.